Chris Alderman will be speaking on Friedrich Nietzsche and the Hermeneutics of Suspicion. Chris does not have a degree in philosophy. Chris does not have a terminal degree at all. Chris is in only his first year of teaching full-time at Gutenberg College. Chris teaches writing, German, and Greek, which are more like skills than subjects, and which in any event are not directly related to tonight's topic. Chris has not published in any venue you've ever heard of. Chris, as a person, constantly falls short of his own moral standards. Chris wrote this biography. Chris is a poor husband, father, son, brother, friend, teacher, colleague, and neighbor. Chris is an irresponsible citizen. Chris is that guy who can't really play an instrument but always insists on performing publicly every chance he gets. Chris, but tends to think rather highly of himself in spite of all this. Please make him welcome.
That's not how speakers are usually introduced, is it? I wonder why that is. In memory of David Foster Wallace, there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who believe there are two kinds of people in the world, and those who don't. I'm speaking tonight, as Elliot mentioned, on Friedrich Nietzsche and the Hermeneutics of Suspicion. I'm not going to be dwelling a lot on the second part of that, what Hermeneutics of Suspicion means, and my topic has changed slightly since I came up with the title, but it will get into there a little. Let me tell you a little bit about my relationship with Nietzsche's work. In some ways, its arc is that of a failed romance, infatuation, come down, separation. So as far as the infatuation goes, I first encountered the work of Nietzsche about 15 years ago, my sophomore year in college, in a philosophy course on existentialist philosophers. I did my term paper in the style of Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. That was an interesting experience. I wrote on Nietzsche again 2 years later in a religion course that I took. It was entitled The Ethics of Self-Creation. And in line with some of the ideals that Nietzsche espouses, at the time, I refused to wear glasses for my astigmatism because I felt that that was a crutch that was getting in the way of my fully embracing and cultivating my strength of will. Something from my journals at this time that bears on this. You are godlike insofar as you look to your own hearts for strength. So this was one of my Nietzschean epigrams at the time. And finally, in the last stage of infatuation, I spent a year and a half in Japan teaching English there after I graduated from college. And during my solitude, during the solitude of my sojourn there, I took great consolation in Thus Spake Zarathustra, the work of someone even more alienated than myself. Eventually, I did have a kind of come down or a cooling off of my passion for Nietzsche. Toward the end of my time in Japan, I wrote a parody of Nietzsche on the guitar entitled Nietzsche's Schnurrbart, which means Nietzsche's mustache. And later on, as a grad student, I wrote in a much more sort of neutral academic way on Nietzsche and Heidegger and their style of philosophy, their polemical style. The third stage and final stage in my relationship with the work of Nietzsche, that of separation, began in some ways with my reading of G.K. Chesterton's Heretics, where he takes apart a lot of 19th century writers, thinkers, philosophers. It was a very influential work in the development of my thought. And also, as part of this whole movement of separation, has been my reacquaintance with Nietzsche here at Gutenberg. I got a chance to reread him, The Will to Power, along with this year's juniors last year. And of course, my research for this talk has also given me, I think, a little more insight than I had before. I'm going to talk tonight, in particular, about the Genealogy of Morals. There are different titles for this work. It's, of course, translation of the title, zur Genealogie de Morals, and that can be translated different ways, but genealogy, of course, is kind of an ancestry, a family tree, as it were. And the title, I believe, is based to some extent on the biological work of Charles Darwin, for instance, the genealogy of biological, physiological organisms. So this is a hearkening back to that. The reason I take the genealogy, which was written in 1887, toward the end of the 19th century, is because in some ways it's his most influential work, and that's because it's his most coherent, it's his most systematic, in some ways it's his most provocative, and it is one of the great books that students are bound to run into, even students who aren't studying philosophy in particular. It's one of the books that students here at Gutenberg read. In form, it consists of 3 essays. The first is entitled Good and Evil, Good and Bad. It's about how morals developed and how, well, we'll get into the exact argument. This is the essay we'll be focusing on today. The other 2 essays have to do with the genealogies of guilt, bad conscience, psychological phenomena. And finally, the 3rd essay has to do with the meaning of ascetic ideals, often associated with religion, religious practices, religious morality. The reason I focus on the first essay is, well, partly in the interest of time, partly because it is foundational to the other 2 essays. They build each upon the previous one, and it also gives us enough to work with, and it's very characteristic of Nietzsche in some ways. So we'll get a lot out of just looking at this one essay. The argument, if any of you happened to read this sort of sneak peek at the community class this week, is that Christianity, in spite of its pretensions to being a gospel of love, is actually the disguised expression of a hatred for one's neighbor. Our questions for tonight: what is one to make of such an argument? And what are we to make of how Nietzsche makes such an argument? The second question in particular will have extensive ramifications. Really, that's the question I'm more interested in some ways. But let's begin with the argument itself, so we understand it. This is not meant to be this is more an analysis of Nietzsche's argument than it is a critique, though there will be an opportunity for me to say some of the problems I find with the argument. Obviously, as a Christian, there are reasons I have to, maybe look twice at what the argument is saying. Nietzsche's presuppositions. So we all have presuppositions. Nietzsche is no different. Our presuppositions, in some ways, always influence our arguments, sometimes even determine them at the outset. Nietzsche's presuppositions, in this work in particular, are 3 in number, I would say, especially as far as this first essay is concerned. First, we have Darwinism. Darwin published Origin of the Species in 1859, which is, less than 20 years before the publication of Genealogy of Morals. It was groundbreaking at the time. It was radically shaking things up. So Darwinism, as opposed, let us say, if we want to think of his presuppositions and kind of the presuppositions that he is challenging, we have, of course, a literal interpretation of Genesis in particular. Presupposition number 2, voluntarism. And he didn't have a passion to volunteer for charitable causes. That's not the kind of voluntarism I mean. For him, evolution, Darwinian evolution, is not the result of a mechanistic senselessness, translation of his words, but of the will to power. So it's not the mechanism of evolution is not natural selection. as Darwin had it, but something more like what the French biologist Lamarck believed. That is the result of a spontaneous, aggressive, this is a quote, spontaneous, aggressive, expansive, form-giving force that gives new interpretations and directions to things. So dynamic individuals determine the course that evolution takes. This, of course, is, again, if we have a list of his presuppositions and, on the other hand, the list of presuppositions that they are meant to counter, you would put Darwin over here because this is not Darwin's view. Herbert Spencer was an English philosopher who held something very much like Darwin's ideas and applied them to, the genealogy of morals, for instance. So in some ways, Spencer is the kind of silent interlocutor of the argument here. In this voluntarism, I see the influence of Arthur Schopenhauer, whom Nietzsche, of course, was a very big fan of. In the earlier phase of his career, he wrote The World as Will and Representation, I believe is the name of it. I've read bits and pieces of it. Will is what keeps things going. So I think there is definitely to be found there in Nietzsche's will to power kind of vestige or legacy of his reading of Schopenhauer, his debt to Schopenhauer. Finally, naturalism, of course, and this follows pretty closely on the heels of his Darwinism. And by this, naturalism, I mean the kind of opposite of teleology. Teleology, of course, kind of got its start with Aristotle. That's whom we associate it with most. It's the idea that all the things we see have a purpose, and they've always had that purpose, and they are only good insofar as they perform that function, insofar as they behave in line with that purpose. For example, the hand, what is the hand for? It's for grasping, right? I believe this is one of the examples that Aristotle uses. The hand is for grasping. It was always for grasping. There was no time in the past at which it was not for grasping. Nietzsche says this is wrong on the basis of, the idea of natural selection is that you have a chance mutation. It occurs by chance, and the only reason it perpetuates itself is because it confers reproductive advantages. So originally, the hand would, by this logic, have had no purpose, no teleology, right? And these presuppositions go hand in hand with Nietzsche's atheism, of course. Darwin was not really an atheist, although what sort of deist he was, I'm not quite sure. But there are similarities there. Hegel is also another interlocutor of Nietzsche's. Hegel was kind of the most recent manifestation of teleological thinking. The course of the spirit, the world spirit, is always upward and onward, is always approaching the maximum of freedom of spirit. So Nietzsche was against all of this stuff. Now, his argument, which I've already told you, Christianity is, in fact, the disguised expression of a hatred for one's neighbor. His argument begins with a discovery that he claims that he made. And like Herbert Spencer, this English philosopher, as Spencer applied evolutionary theory in different spheres of thought, Nietzsche did the same thing in the sphere of linguistics. So, he says, tracked to their etymological roots words like good and bad, for instance. And what he found, he says, is that good, I believe the words he uses are in all languages or everywhere or something like this, can be tracked back to the original word for noble, aristocratic, high, that sort of thing. And originally, to the contrary, bad could be tracked to its opposite, right? Low, base, things like this. And what this meant, this is the kind of, again, the evolution of these words that we see. And we'll look in particular at which languages he talks about when we examine the strength of these arguments he makes. But basically, he argues that this genealogy, this linguistic genealogy, implies that originally there was what he calls an aristocratic value equation, a noble morality, where good meant noble, meant powerful, meant beautiful, meant happy, meant beloved of God. And these were applied, of course, by the noble, powerful, and beautiful to themselves, right? We are the good. This was, Nietzsche characterizes it, an affirmative or an active valuation. So again, it's the good, the noble, the noble, the powerful, the beautiful, saying we are the good. It's positive, it's affirmative, it's pro these things, right? It's life positive. I'm trying to think of the kind of language we hear these days. Bad, on the other hand, was more like an afterthought. So bad is simply whatever we are not. It's kind of in opposition. It had no real positive value of its own. It's just the opposite. Also, originally, Nietzsche says, there was no word for evil. There was no word for evil. There was good and bad. That is, they were judgments of quality more than moral judgments. So they were not moral judgments, but judgments of, again, strength, nobility, power, that sort of thing. Now, at some point in history, this value equation was inverted, Nietzsche argues, by the Jews. This is what he calls the slave revolt in morality. The Jews he characterizes as a priestly people, and that this slave revolt in morality was an act of spiritual revenge against those who were stronger than they were. So because the Jewish people, a priestly people, could not rival in power, outward power, political power, the strength of the aristocrats with whom they were opposed, they began this revolt in morality. And how it took place was by means of language and other things as well, but this is where he tracks it. This is where he finds it. So the slave revolt in morality, the new equation, the inversion of these values, began with evil. So evil, the term, the concept, came into being, and it meant noble, powerful, beautiful. That is, you are evil. You are the evil. And of course, this is different, Nietzsche says, than we are the good, not just in that they're talking about different things, but this is fundamentally negative, right? It's bad, right? It's starting with what's bad and not with what's good. And it's reactive, right? It requires that something outside of oneself confront you, and a reaction is required. And good, of course, in the same way that bad for the original noble morality was a kind of afterthought, good too in the slave revolts, in the slave morality, was an afterthought. It was just the opposite. And it happened to be that the revolters, the people who espoused the slave morality, of course, were the good ones, right? You are the evil, and by that definition, we are the good, because we are not powerful, because we are not noble, because we are not beautiful. So love of God, love of neighbor, is actually part of this reevaluation process. And it's a product of a very important term that Nietzsche uses. It's taken from the French. Elliot probably knows the pronunciation. Ressentiment, or something like that. Resentment, it's sometimes been translated. But it's not this Judeo-Christian love of God and love of neighbor is not what it seems to be, but in fact the product of a kind of envious inversion of values. So let us turn to our first quote. This is number one. This is, well, you'll see. It's pretty important. Christian love grew out of Jewish hatred as its crown, driven as it were into the domain of light and the heights in pursuit of the goals of that hatred, victory, spoil, and seduction. This Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate gospel of love, this Redeemer who brought blessedness and victory to the poor, the sick, and the sinners, was he not this seduction in its most uncanny and irresistible form? A seduction and bypath to precisely those Jewish values and new ideals? Did Israel not attain the ultimate goal of its sublime vengefulness precisely through the bypath of this Redeemer, this ostensible opponent and disintegrator of Israel? Was it not part of the secret black art of truly grand politics of revenge, of a far-seen, subterranean, slowly advancing, and premeditated revenge, that Israel must itself deny the real instrument of its revenge before all the world as a mortal enemy and nail it to the cross, so that all the world, namely all the opponents of Israel, could unhesitatingly swallow just this bait? And could spiritual subtlety imagine any more dangerous bait than this? Anything to equal the enticing, intoxicating, overwhelming, and undermining power of that symbol of the Holy Cross, that ghastly paradox of a God on the cross, that mystery of an unimaginable ultimate cruelty and self-crucifixion of God for the salvation of man. So what is he saying here? He is saying, he is characterizing Jesus of Nazareth as bait, as a sort of tool in this revolt of slave morality, effectively. And this, where am I? Okay. The conclusion, of course, to draw from this is that Christian, and at Nietzsche's time this would have meant European morality, was not only a sham, is not only a sham, but in fact the very opposite of what it pretends to be. Right? Jesus was pivotal in a kind of bait and switch. He didn't represent the love that rhetorically he espoused, and his followers espoused, and his predecessors espoused, but actually resentment on the part of the Jews toward those more powerful than them. Now, what is a Christian to do with such a claim? First of all, let's recognize together, if we will, that Nietzsche's claim may not be as crazy as it seems. The claim of the resurrection is actually crazier. So the claim that someone actually rose from the dead is actually crazier than this conspiracy theory. So that's important that we recognize. Let's assume, for the moment, that the resurrection was a hoax, right? What would that mean exactly? I think C.S. Lewis gives us some of the alternatives. May not be an exhaustive list. If Jesus was not who he said he was, well, a liar or a madman. It's unclear from Nietzsche's account whether he considers Jesus to have been an unknowing or a knowing dupe. If he was a knowing dupe, he would have been a liar. If he was an unknowing dupe, he would have been a madman, influenced by, under the great enthusiasm of this slave revolt of morality. If the resurrection didn't happen, if it was a hoax, then, as Paul says, Christians are of all people most to be pitied. He recognizes what is at stake in this. And of course, if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is the blight on European Western civilization that Nietzsche says it is later on, and has, for the last 2,000 years, gotten in the way of people's true freedom, right? True emancipation, true autonomy, all of these things. You hear things like this sometimes about what the meaning of Christianity truly is. Now, the takeaway, our first takeaway from our study of Nietzsche as people who take Christianity seriously, is that historical claims about Jesus Christ have to be taken seriously. And Nietzsche's taken them very seriously, and it behooves us to take them seriously as well. For that reason, it behooves us to look carefully at the strength of Nietzsche's historical claims. And there are 3 points I'd like to touch on briefly here. First thing I would observe is that, in part, the strength of Nietzsche's historical claims depends on his presuppositions, right? So if all is will to power, sure, this makes sense, right? If everything we do is driven by our secret or at least deep unconscious need to control things, to get the upper hand, to master, to overcome, to subdue, then yeah, you have to look at the crucifixion as the product of this, right? You have to look at everything as the product of this. But that's where Nietzsche begins. So the crucifixion was the product of an exertion of the will to power, because the will to power is seen in all exertions, or something like that. It's tautological, right? It's begging the question is the term. So that's kind of what presuppositions do, is they set up circles of reasoning, and I think that's one of the things we see here. So if you doubt that all is will to power, then you may very well doubt his interpretation of the crucifixion. Second, regarding his presuppositions, Nietzsche's acceptance of evolutionary theory, but not its mechanism, that is natural selection, is surely problematic. He seems to be wanting to have it both ways. Like, he accepts evolutionary theory because it gets him far enough along to dispense with Christianity, but then he goes in another way because it would carry him past where he wants to get off the ride. Again, having it both ways, I don't know that there is a technical term for that logical fallacy, but there ought to be. Now, his discovery. So his discovery, it's the cake fallacy, right? Wanting to have his cake and eat it too. So his discovery, that is his linguistic genealogy. If you remember, good coming from powerful, noble, beautiful, that sort of thing. One thing we have to understand here is that Nietzsche was made full professor of classical philology at the age of 24, which was unheard of at the time. It remains unheard of. I will never be professor of classical philology. Nietzsche did it at 24. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant philologist. Philologist is a linguist, literally a lover of the word. So that's something we need to consider, to keep in mind. We would expect the linguistic genealogy of someone who has been a classical philologist for, at this point, he died in his 40s. He would have been around 40, I think, when he wrote the genealogy. We would expect this to be pretty impressive, right? However, what we see in practice is that the genealogy that he provides, this linguistic genealogy, is fragmentary, scattered, unsystematic. For instance, he looks at several languages, right? He looks at German, Latin, Greek. He looks at Indo-European languages, of course, because it's Western civilization he's talking about. But let's look at, I'll just give you an example of some of these things. So German word for good, gut, right, is actually related by him, not to noble, but godlike, in fact. Gut, Gott, very similar. So this seems to point in a different direction. Second, German bad, schlecht, received its current meaning in the 17th century. This is long after the slave revolt and morality. Latin good, bonus, is related, again by Nietzsche himself, to warlike, quality of a warrior. Again, not that of a nobleman or an aristocrat necessarily, right? And Latin bad, malus, he connects with Greek melas, black, which may, according to Nietzsche, it may be related to melas, in which case it seems to me it's not classist, that is, putting aristocrats over the low, but racist, right? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the initial distinction he's talking about. There is no genealogy provided by him of evil at all. So if evil, the term evil, the concept evil, is the innovation, why isn't he looking at that and pointing us to where in history this actually crops up? There is no genealogy for any Hebrew words, which it seems to me is rather important if it's the Jewish people who are initiating this slave revolt and morality. He's most convincing on Greek etymology. But if you read this, his argument seems to be based primarily on Greek etymology. But he's claiming that all languages in which he has investigated this phenomenon show the same thing. So if he makes a claim about all languages based primarily upon observations about one language, I would call that the logical fallacy of hasty generalization. Finally, the evidence, the historical evidence for this slave revolt of morality. It's based partly upon prejudice he appeals to in his reader. Listen to this. As is well known, the priests are the, quote, sorry, this is all a quote. As is well known, the priests are the most evil enemies. So this is what is known as the bandwagon fallacy, right? As is well known, we don't need to cite actual evidence for this, the priests are the most evil enemies, an appeal to the crowd, a jumping on the bandwagon. The primary evidence he adduces, apart from his linguistic genealogy, is his own insight as a psychologist, as what he calls the first psychologist, and this very speculative history. And of course, this speculative history is completely unfalsifiable. It's unprovable, it's unfalsifiable, it's untestable. It remains in the region of speculation. So perhaps, but he's not going to convince us with this. But people have been convinced by Nietzsche's argument. Conclusion. The strength of Nietzsche's historical claims does not account for the appeal of his argument. The question is, what does? And let us segue to a little primer on classical rhetoric. In classical rhetoric, you had, this is classical rhetoric after Aristotle. Quintilian was the Roman who kind of took the stuff up. I talk about some of this stuff in the writing courses that I teach here. This is a triangle. This is the rhetorical triangle, in case you didn't guess. We have one corner of the rhetorical triangle. These are Greek words. So logos. This is the logical appeal. And I'm just going to throw this stuff on the board before we talk about what an appeal is. And then we have, over on the right, what do we have? We've got pathos. And this is the pathetic or emotional appeal. And then we have up the top, ethos. Ethos, or the ethical appeal. Now, this is a diagram of, really in some ways, the kind of appeal that a speech or an essay makes. The logical appeal, it focuses on the subject, right? We're not talking about, we're talking about Nietzsche's argument. We're focusing on the subject. We're making logical appeals, perhaps logical fallacies. Sorry if we are. That is, in some ways, what we think of as a hallmark of good persuasive writing. But it's only one of the appeals that the classical rhetoricians saw as effective, and not just effective, but perfectly legitimate. Another, well, we'll get to the others. We have been looking at the logical appeal that Nietzsche has been making. So his linguistic genealogy. Is it consistent? Is it systematic? These are questions that have to do with logic, with reason. Logos is another name for reason. What sort of appeal is Nietzsche really making? Again, I've kind of gone through some of the things I see as problematic about his logical appeal. I believe that it is, in fact, the pathetic or the emotional appeal that he exerts most profoundly in his writing. And I think that also, in retrospect, accounts for why Nietzsche appealed so much to me in my youth. And that's because a young man, regardless of his actual endowments, tends to think of himself as noble, powerful, beautiful, better and higher than the average. And such a young man will incline toward a philosophy of life that justifies his thinking of himself and others in terms of such a dichotomy. So Nietzsche's philosophy appealed to an emotional need that I felt at the time. Or if not a need, an emotional desire. The desire to believe that I was part of a select set of people, that I was special, that I was distinguished, that I was in a different class, almost ontologically speaking, than the throng, right? That I was with Nietzsche, that I was with Yeats, that I was with Walt Whitman, and that everyone else was over here. This, of course, is a problematic way to appeal to people, we might say. For evidence of this, I would cite a couple things. Let's turn to our quote number 2, if we would. Let's look at this through the eyes of a rhetorician. This is what Nietzsche says. Would anyone like to take a look into the secret of how ideals are made on earth? Who has the courage? Very well. Here is a point we can see through into this dark workshop. But wait a minute or two, Mr. Rash and Curious. Your eyes must first get used to this false iridescent light. All right, now speak. What is going on down there? Say what you see, man of the most perilous kind of inquisitiveness. Now I am the one who is listening. Now, Nietzsche, who is this Mr. Rash and Curious? Who is this man of the most perilous kind of inquisitiveness? Who are the parties of this conversation? Isn't it just Nietzsche and the reader? So if it's not Nietzsche, it's the reader he's talking to. We are being addressed, right? This is the second person singular imperative and vocative, right? He is talking to us. We are this rash and curious person, perilously inquisitive. And not only that, we are actually now in the position of telling Nietzsche what the real scoop is. We've got a view into this that not even Nietzsche has. What Nietzsche has done here, what Nietzsche does throughout his writing is appeal in this way to the reader's vanity, pride, conceit, things like this. We want to think of ourselves as intellectually inquisitive, as perhaps even rash in our desire to discover what the truth really is. And he appeals to that emotional or psychological desire or weakness in us. He's more explicit about the nature of the appeal that he makes in Ecce Homo, which is kind of a companion text to, well, not really. It's often included in translations of Genealogy of Morals. It's kind of a retrospective on his work, but he describes his style, though, in it. And his style is meant to communicate his, and I quote, pathos to those, quote, capable and worthy of the same pathos. The focus here is not the subject, of course. It's the audience. So Nietzsche, his style is meant to appeal to an emotion, a pathos, in his reader. He is communicating with the initiated, with the elect, as it were. And what sense does it make to speak of the elect, the initiated, things like this? Here we can talk a little bit, very briefly, about Nietzsche's typology. Nietzsche believed that, and as I suggested before, as I wanted to think of myself as a member of a select set, ontologically distinct from the common run of men, Nietzsche actually believed, or seems to have believed, certainly writes a lot about it, that there were higher men and there were lower men, right? Higher human beings and lower human beings. Who do you think, take a guess, what's an example? Who's on the list of Nietzsche's higher men, do you think? Achilles. Napoleon. So Achilles, the only reason I pause is because Achilles being a character, he doesn't talk a lot about, he would say Homer. Homer definitely. Napoleon, actually in the Genealogy of Morals, that's who he lists. Napoleon came along after the French Revolution, right? French Revolution, the latest manifestation of slave morality, democracy, these things, nothing like that. Napoleon came around in response to this and reestablished the rights of the few, right? Napoleon is definitely his example in Genealogy of Morals. But Goethe, Beethoven, Napoleon is kind of an exception in that he's not an artist. Usually it's artists that receive the palm from him. We're missing someone. We're missing someone, though. We're missing someone. Yeah, we're still missing someone. Someone important. Nietzsche himself! Yes, Nietzsche himself, of course, was one of these higher men. Okay. So, Nietzsche is communicating as a higher man to other higher men. We've got pathos. The audience is, you have to have a particular kind of audience or this is not going to work. You can understand what he's saying, but if you're not a higher man yourself, it's going to fall on deaf ears. It's going to fall by the wayside. I think that was pretty Wagnerian, actually. It's kind of dissonant. So, we have covered the logical appeal, the emotional appeal. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the ethical appeal. If you read my blurb for this week, you would have noticed the mention of the ethical appeal. Ethos, this means something more like character in Greek. Can also mean someone's kind of moral standing. So it doesn't mean exactly what we think of with ethical. Let's look at quote number 3. This is from David Foster Wallace's Authority in American Usage. He's talking about the ethical appeal, and I'm just hoping this will help us understand it a little bit better. Here the adjective, derived from the Greek ethos, doesn't mean quite what we usually mean by ethical, but there are affinities. What the ethical appeal amounts to is a complex and sophisticated trust me. It's the boldest, most ambitious, and also most democratic of rhetorical appeals, because it requires the rhetor, I don't know how to pronounce that in Greek, but not in English, to convince us not just of his intellectual acuity or technical competence, but of his basic decency and fairness and sensitivity to the audience's own hopes and fears. So we have here, what or whom do you think is the focus of this? We've got subject, audience, speaker. Yeah. So this appeal, this rhetorical appeal, focuses on the character of the speaker as a means of persuasion in classical rhetoric. Now, how did you guys feel at the reading of my bio? The reading of my bio. What sort of effect did that have from the perspective of an ethical appeal? What sort of ethical appeal did or did not that make?
Made me feel awkward.
Made you feel awkward? Why?
I felt like I was criticizing you.
Okay.
Which is unusual.
Why'd you feel like you were criticizing me? It was all true. Everything you read was true. Everything you read was true.
I'll have to count on you for that analysis.
Okay. What was the effect of, what picture of me did you take away? Because it was true, but I might say that it was fallacious. You may have heard of the fallacy, it's an ethical fallacy, poisoning the well. It's when before someone even gets up to the podium, you sort of sneak in a jab at the person. What effect did it have?
It diminishes our confidence in you.
Why? What was it about that diminished your confidence?
Your level of character was maybe lower than we had expected.
What's one of the facts that diminished your confidence in me? In the bio. How about the fact that I don't have a degree in philosophy? I'm up here talking about a philosopher. I don't have a degree in philosophy. A degree in philosophy, a degree in what you're talking about, is a qualification, right? You expect certain qualifications. Otherwise, what are you here spending your time doing, right? Listening to some guy who does a degree in philosophy talking about philosophy. If you were to go down that list, you would see that each of those things, each of those facts, they're all true, serves to undermine my ethical appeal. In that respect, it's an ethical fallacy, despite, again, its truth. So something that can be true and yet fallacious at the same time. I'd like to look at Nietzsche's ethical appeal.
Is that the same as the ad hominem fallacy?
Yes, so an ad hominem is another kind of ethical appeal. So, for instance, the fact that I'm someone who, despite the fact that I don't really play music very well in public, likes to play music in public, that has no bearing on my qualifications for discussing Nietzsche. But it might very well incline you to think less of me, less, in fact, of my talk. Even though there's no relation, that's an ad hominem. It's to or against the man, the person, him or herself. It doesn't have anything to do with the person's qualifications. That's why it's a fallacy, right? There are ethical appeals and ethical fallacies. It's not a legitimate use of the ethical appeal. A logical fallacy is an illegitimate application of a logical appeal. One of the things I would add to the list of David Foster Wallace names some of these things: decency, fairness, sensitivity. He does say intellectual acuity or technical competence. If I were misconjugating my English verbs up here in front of you, that would be a very poor reflection, very poor ethical appeal. I would show you again that I'm not really qualified to do this. So competence, acuity, qualifications, decency, fairness, sensitivity. I would add, and David Foster Wallace doesn't talk about this. This essay of his is really all about the ethical appeal. Humility. And I would like to talk specifically about Nietzsche's lack of humility. There were several times as I was going through the Genealogy of Morals when I found myself writing in my notes things like, "What ridiculous presumption." Take some of these quotes. These are all from very different portions of the genealogy. "This precisely is the long story of how X originated. The answer is beyond doubt. There can be no doubt whatever. This should dispose once and for all of the question of how X originated. Now, this is all the more presumptuous, it seems to me, when, for X, you substitute God, for instance. So this should dispose once and for all of the question of how the holy God originated. Nietzsche may be right, but he has not made the sort of logical appeals or ethical appeals. In fact, he's torpedoing his ethical appeal right now to justify the claims he makes. Either you're one of these higher men who already believe what he's saying, or you're not. And if you're not, he doesn't really care. Another example of his, really I'd say his neglect of the ethical appeal. We've seen how he's neglected the logical appeal. We're now looking at how he neglects the ethical appeal. If you turn to number 4, this is from Ecce Homo. Among my writings, my Zarathustra stands to my mind by itself. With that, I have given mankind the greatest present that has ever been made to it so far. This book, with a voice bridging centuries, is not only the highest book there is, it is also the deepest, born out of the innermost wealth of truth, an inexhaustible well to which no pail descends without coming up again filled with gold and goodness. So even when I was a big fan of Nietzsche, I was kind of left cold by this. The title of the work in which this appears, Ecce Homo, is of course the Latin for behold the man, as it's usually translated in John, what Pilate says when Jesus is presented to the crowd. So what we do with that, obviously Nietzsche is comparing or contrasting himself with Jesus, right? We talk about a Messiah complex. He signs one of his letters at least, Der Gekreuzigte, which means the crucified. So that's another example of, again, that's a kind of ethical appeal he's making. We see something of his character when he either equates himself or compares himself or contrasts himself with someone like Jesus Christ. The first 3 titles of Ecce Homo, this was again toward the end of his book, the end of his career. Why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books. And finally, Nietzsche, for reasons we'll talk about, does not acknowledge personal responsibility for his misdeeds. And this has to do with humility, right? He does not acknowledge that he ever went wrong. And here I was reminded of, in fact, I thought at first that this maybe was Nietzsche. James Joyce has a saying that genius does not make mistakes, something like that. So genius always knows what it's doing, even when the genius does not. Nietzsche refers to this several times throughout the genealogy when he talks about guilt. Guilt, he says, is just another one of these mental phenomena that arose through the slave revolt and morality. He says that kind of natural state of affairs is for someone to think when, from our perspective, someone has done something wrong, morally wrong, that is. Here's something has unexpectedly gone wrong. Not, I ought not to have done that. So take your pick, right? We can think of any sort of what most of us today would consider moral evils. Take, I mean, the reductio ad Hitlerem, I don't mean to, that's another sort of fallacy where everything's reduced to Hitler, but you know, you can imagine the Holocaust and that being kind of Hitler thinking to himself in the bunker shortly before shooting himself, here's something has unexpectedly gone wrong. Not, I ought not to have done that, right? Notice that the subject of that, here, something has unexpectedly gone wrong, is the something not the the subject of I ought not to have done that. There is a philosophical justification for Nietzsche's position on that, and that is he didn't believe in free will. He thought free will, too, was a fabrication of, if not slave morality, religion. And because there's no free will, there's no subject. And his Darwinism and naturalism feed into this, but he likens the person to a bolt of lightning. Bolt of lightning is its blazing, right? Is its lightening. In the same way, a higher man, say, a Goethe, a Napoleon, is what a Napoleon does. And there's no way around it. Napoleon could not actually have acted any other way. Hitler could not have acted any other way. Nietzsche could not have acted any other way. No free will, no subject. Everything is predetermined. This is materialist determinism. So really, there's no character to express. Nietzsche is what he is. And either you resonate with that or you don't. So this also explains, of course, why he neglects the logical appeal. And that's because we don't respond to logic. Either, again, we feel the same way or we don't. We feel the same way or we don't. Logic is not going to reach us. An ethical appeal isn't going to reach us. There's no person to whom these can even be addressed. I was going to say that I actually think, and I haven't heard anyone say this, that Nietzsche goes out of his way to make laughably fallacious logical appeals and ridiculous ethical appeals to highlight this very point in his philosophy. I mean, who in his right mind would write a chapter entitled Why I Am So Wise? Nietzsche knows what he's doing. Nietzsche was brilliant, right? Nietzsche was chair of classical philology at the age of 24, and knew what he was doing. He read more in his relatively short life than probably all of us in this room ever will. Nietzsche was a brilliant man. He knew exactly what he was doing, and I think because he really believed this stuff. He really believed that it doesn't matter what sort of logical appeal you make, what sort of ethical appeal you make. And for that reason, I think he plays around with these. And this is where the importance for him is. It's in the style. Now, these metaphysical presuppositions of his, that there is no free will, there is no subject, there's no doer, there's only the deed. This could be called antipsychologism, and it has been. I personally have doubts as to its coherency. He calls himself a psychologist, but what are you a student of if there is no psyche, right? If there is no soul, if there is no subject, if there is no doer, what are you really a psychologist of? We don't understand a studier or an expert on feelings or emotions by the term psychologist. So I have doubts as to the coherency of this. But what is certain, it seems to me, is that Nietzsche's dichotomy of higher men, lower men, and his doctrine of the will to power, that is, both higher men and lower men are all jockeying for power, prestige, importance. I'm certain that these things led to a misreading of the Bible and a fundamental misunderstanding of Judeo-Christian morality. This misreading and misunderstanding don't necessarily mean that Nietzsche was wrong, although it certainly causes problems for his argument, because the a reading of the Bible does not leave you with the impression that the Israelites, the Jewish people, whether this is Old Testament or New Testament, are saying, you, that is, you the Canaanites, you the Egyptians, are the evil ones, and we are the good. That's not what even a superficial reading of the Bible leaves you with. Instead, as I see it, it's something more like God is the good, and we human beings are the evil. That is, higher men, lower men, it's all the same. The only distinction to be made is between man and God. And this is very much to the contrary of what Nietzsche is saying. Not only is it not creating divisions between the evil and the good people, but it's also positive. God is good. Old Testament begins with Genesis, God creating, creation being good. Nietzsche is analyzing the rhetoric of this slave revolt and morality. He doesn't cleave very closely to the actual evidence that we do have. So I think his typology, higher, lower, and his doctrine of the will to power, that is, at the root of all that we do, is a jockeying for power, led him to a fundamental misreading of the Bible, misunderstanding of Judeo-Christian morality, and therefore caused serious problems for his argument. As evidence for this, that my understanding of the Bible in these terms, God is the good, we humans are the evil. Take your pick. Consider, if you would, the protagonists. You wouldn't call them protagonists. Consider, if you would, the human characters in the Old Testament. Consider Abraham and his twice passing his wife off as a sister. Consider Moses and his disobeying the will of God and being forbidden entrance into the Promised Land. Consider Israel itself as a people and the constant cycle of infidelity to God. And consider David. David is certainly not portrayed as the most upright of people. These are the Old Testament figures, right? These are fundamentally different, portrayed fundamentally differently than the heroes of whether it's Homeric epic, Gilgamesh, the writings ascribed to the Buddha or about the Buddha, the Quran, all of these things. In those writings, we do see something like, these are the good. But that's not what we see in the Old Testament. Then you have Jesus and Mark, of course, saying, no one is good except God alone. Someone approaches him and says, good teacher. And he says, why do you call me good? No one is good save God alone. And then, of course, justification by faith. Why is that necessary? Because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. One more thing I'll read from you pertaining to the Bible. This is quote number 5. You may know this as the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful on me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. As I read this, I think it's clear that the tax collector isn't the only sinner in the picture. We've got 2 sinners here, and what distinguishes the 2 is the tax collector's acknowledgement of his being a sinner. and his calling out to God for mercy. So this brings us back to the epigraph for my talk tonight. There are two kinds of people in the world, those who think there are two kinds of people in the world and those who don't. As I see it, the best we can do is a kind of Socratic goodness. That is a knowledge of our own evil, basically. If the Christian is any different from the non-Christian, it is only in believing that we are all equally in need of God's grace, i.e., that in this most crucial respect, we are no different at all. Humility, in these terms, if we believe that this is true, is not what Nietzsche calls an anxious lowliness. It's not the higher man, the strong man, the noble man, pretending to be weak, dissembling. What it is a simple acknowledgement of the human condition before God. Interestingly, to fight fire with fire, I have some etymology too. And what we have, when we look at the word humility, can be traced back to, we get it in the word humus, earth. What also can be traced back to the word for earth? Gaia, in the Greek, little different. Humanity, human. Humility and humanity have the same etymological origin. And it's not just in Latin, right? This is in, apparently, groom and bridegroom is actually descended from the same root of all of this. It's obscured by linguistic transformations, but we have the same root, and it's earth, it's dust. Humility, humanity. Of course, this is very interesting in light of the Genesis account of creation, but also, I mean, you don't have to be any sort of believer in anything having to do with the Bible to understand that we return to the dust, right? Our bodies return to whence they came. So I'm providing an alternative etymology, not an alternative etymology, a complementary etymology. What's interesting about this, of course, is that this word, this hearkening back, is far older. The word for man, for instance, again, goes back to earth in Indo-European. Far older than the terms good, bad, evil, right? This is a concrete noun, What is good? It's either an adjective, when you don't talk about adjectives or qualities before you have something to ascribe qualities to, or it's an abstract noun, good, as in the good. Either way, this concrete noun is prior. So if you go back far enough, this precedes anything Nietzsche is talking about, any possible transformations. This equation of humility, humanity, and dust, shall we say. And that, it seems to me, is significant. So my argument number one for tonight is that humility is not just... humility has nothing to do with a stance or a pose or an attitude. It simply involves recognition of what and who we really are. And for that reason, it's necessary. This is where the will to truth takes us. Argument number two. I think I have time for this. Great. I'm closing in on the end. Argument number two. The ethical appeal. Well, there's a reason why it's at the top of the triangle. I didn't make this triangle. I don't know whether Aristotle used this particular figure, but the ethical appeal, I believe, is of first importance in the formation of our beliefs. Not the emotional appeal, not even the logical appeal. I won't talk much about emotional appeal. I don't think that's where our reservations would lie. I don't think there are many of us here in this room who would think that the emotional appeal takes precedence. This is how our kind of belief-forming process gets kicked into action. I will address the logical appeal. So, why do I argue that the ethical appeal is of first importance in the formation of our beliefs and not the logical appeal? We'll consider this. If we trust someone, we tend to believe him or her even in default of a logical appeal. Lots of examples of this. Think about your own experience. Someone tells you something is the case. If you trust the person, you believe that person, right? But think of Abraham's faith, for instance. Think of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. He trusted God. He trusted God's promises. In the face of what seemed like an insoluble, logical contradiction. How can you make me a father of nations through Isaac if I sacrifice him to you? Right? So not just in default of the logical appeal, but in the teeth of what seemed like a logical impossibility. Of course, Kierkegaard talks about this in Fear and Trembling, which coincidentally I read in the same class in which I first encountered Nietzsche. Existentialist philosophy. So, if we trust someone, we tend to believe him or her even in default of logical appeal. Conversely, if we do not trust someone, we tend not to believe him or her even in the face of a logical appeal. This is the moral of the story, the boy who cried wolf, right? Doesn't matter if, in some cases, even facts, like very simple facts. Think back to a time when you were reading an article by someone whom you did not trust. And think back, have you ever doubted whether the facts the person adduced were in fact true, or were, what's the term now? It's not a real fact? Sure, or fabricated. There's a noun for these non-facts. Anyway, this happens, right? If we don't trust the person, even the facts upon which that person bases ethical, logical, and emotional appeals are suspect in our eyes. In fact, there is no fact that is necessarily above suspicion whatsoever. Think about Descartes, right? The very data of the senses were brought under suspicion. Radical skepticism is possible. You can doubt what your eyes tell you. I have to thank Eliot in part for the reminder that the data senses provide us is something that we have to trust, right? It's another source of, we can doubt them, we can not believe our eyes. That's an interesting locution. I can't believe my eyes. Even the senses are not above suspicion. So even the senses cannot be used infallibly to demonstrate a logical point. Finally, properly speaking, logic is the domain of the syllogism. That is the sort of argument that goes, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The problem is that none of life's big questions can be answered syllogistically. Try coming up with a syllogism, just imagining a syllogism for any important question that you're facing. Try coming up with one that doesn't beg the question, for instance, for the resurrection, to prove or to disprove the resurrection. It's important, but it cannot be answered logically. We can marshal logical proofs in support of it, but that's not the whole story. And here I would like to turn to a little bit from David Foster Wallace. Look, if you would, with me at quote number 6. This is our final quote for the night. This is from an essay on, it's a review of a dictionary of usage, of English usage. And it's much more interesting than it sounds. And he's referring here to a little speech he would typically give people from less educated backgrounds, or rather from backgrounds where people use a different dialect of English than the English used in academic English. And he would say, he would give a logical, he would make a logical appeal for this student's sucking it up and learning how to write academic English. And we're going to look at the fallout of that. A vividly concrete illustration here concerns the official complaint that a certain black undergraduate filed against me after one of my little in-camera spiels described on pages 108 to 109. The complainant was, I opine, wrong, but she was not crazy or stupid. And I was able later to see that I did bear some responsibility for the whole nasty administrative swivet. My culpability lay in gross rhetorical naivete. I'd seen my speech's primary appeal as logical. The aim was to make a conspicuously blunt, honest argument for standard written English's utility. It wasn't pretty, maybe, but it was true, plus so manifestly bullshit-free that I think I expected not just acquiescence, but gratitude for my candor. Please, just don't even say it. Rhetoric-wise, what happened was that I allowed the substance and style of my logical appeal to completely torpedo my ethical appeal. What the student heard was just another privileged white male rationalizing why his group and his English were top dog and ought, quote, logically to stay that way. Plus, worse, trying to use his academic power over her to coerce her assent. The student professed to have been especially traumatized by the climactic, I am going to make you, which was indeed a rhetorical boner. So, observations. I would have loved to ask for more input during the course of this. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of material to work through, and I will just run right over anything you have to say. Notice a couple things about this. Nietzsche uses his style to make an emotional appeal to his audience. Wallace uses his style, and logical appeals too have styles, ethical appeals have styles, to make the ethical appeal. Notice how he confounds distinctions between higher and lower. So, higher man, lower man, right? Higher English, lower English. Notice how he confounds these distinctions. What are some of the instances of higher English in his writing here? In camera, a Latin phrase, right? The complainant, this is legalese. I opine, this is not the English you hear on the streets. Swivet, notice the orthography on naivete. That little two-dot thing over the I is not necessary. On the other hand, notice the lower register that he adopts. Crazy, stupid. Torpedo used as a verb, for instance. The best illustration of this confounding of distinctions between higher and lower, however, are the footnotes. Note that footnotes, what do we associate them with? Academic English, dry, citations. These are kind of asides. They're humorous comments, right? Please just don't even say it. This isn't even punctuated properly. He knows how to punctuate this. Rhetorical boner, right? You do not find the word boner in a footnote. You just don't. So what he's done is, using his style, confound the distinctions. And I would suggest that this is an illustration of his humanity. He is not someone who is on some higher plane than we are. He is coming down to meet us, or he is coming up to meet us in case we happen to think of ourselves as highly educated professorial types. I won't go into the rest of his essay on authority, American usage, the usage wars. He also dips his feet into the waters of the culture wars. Every time he does, he confounds distinctions. We have on the one side of the usage wars the prescriptivists, and on the other hand, the descriptivists. He's both and neither. On the culture wars, we have pro-life and pro-choice. He's both and neither. How does he do that? Maybe it's not logically consistent, but it exerts a kind of ethical appeal. He's telling you, I am not different from you. Wherever you look, there you will find a shared humanity. I will read you one of his quotes that I think illustrates this in a great way. This was very off the cuff. I think it was from an interview that he was given. I think one of the true ways I've gotten smarter is that I've realized that there are ways other people are a lot smarter than me. How's that for Socratic? That's Socratic intelligence, right? My biggest asset as a writer is that I'm pretty much like everybody else. The parts of me that used to think I was different or smarter or whatever almost made me die. This was very off the cuff. David Foster Wallace was, if anything, more articulate than probably the room full of us together. Maybe I'll speak for myself. Many times more articulate than I am. Listen to some of his interviews on YouTube, for instance, if you're curious. He was literally a card-carrying genius. Does this sound like something a literal card-carrying genius would typically say? No, right? The only literal card-carrying genius I've met spent all of his time translating Japanese video games, which seems to me a waste of genius. But that's an aside. On the topic of, apropos, the word die, some of you may know that David Foster Wallace killed himself in 2008. People have wrestled with what this means for our understanding of his work, his writing, his philosophy, his ethical appeals, his logical appeals, his emotional appeals, because he exerts all of these. And while I'd hesitate to say that suicide could be, that it is an expression of humility, I think that it can be. I think suicide is an acknowledgement of complete and utter failure, or can be. And I think that's one of the things it may have meant for him. And what is an acknowledgement of complete and utter failure, hopelessness, resourcelessness, then a sort of humility. Anyway, I want to end with this, that a more accurate model for how our beliefs are formed is one based upon the concept of trust, is one based upon the ethical appeal, in fact. This could be the topic of an entirely separate talk, but I want to submit at the end, when you don't have time to grill me, that the question is not fundamentally what, but whom we believe. Not fundamentally what, but whom we believe. And of course, I believe this has a special significance for Christians in light of Jesus' saying in the Gospel of John, I am the way and the truth and the life. Truth is not a thing, but a person. And I believe that this may help explain what is meant by and why it's so important to believe in Jesus. What does that mean exactly? Paul in Acts, forget where he was, when they were released from prison, they witness to the jailer, and he asks what he should do. And Paul says, believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved. What does it mean to believe in the Lord Jesus? Again, a topic for another talk, but I think one of the ways to understand this is as evidence for the fact that it is, again, not fundamentally what we believe, but whom. And of course, if we believe someone, then belief in many things follow from it. Again, if you trust someone, the person tells you something, you're more than likely to believe it. So it's not as if we can believe in someone and not believe the things that the person says. How does one come to trust in Jesus Christ? How does one come to trust or believe in Jesus? Well, in Wallace's very complex and sophisticated way. The ethical appeal is not simple. It's complex, it's sophisticated. In some ways, it's much more difficult to do right than a logical appeal is, because we practice this all the time. We also practice this. People are very adept, especially online, it seems to me, at wielding the emotional appeal. But the ethical appeal is harder to find done well. We come to trust in Jesus Christ by coming to trust the witnesses that testify on his behalf. Scripture, other historical and archaeological records, the church, other Christians, our own experience of life, what Socrates called his agathadaimon, his good genius, the opposite of Descartes' evil genius, who sought only to deceive him. We trust these things against the things that might testify against him. But this is no different than the way that we come to believe anyone or anything. Thank you very much. I would love to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
I'm not sure this is a good question. Is it on?
All questions are good questions.
You emphasized Nietzsche's predetermined perspective, yet he doesn't believe in God. So what is the force behind his confidence in predetermination?
So predetermination, predestination, that's a term I associate with a kind of theological determinism. What he would mean by determinism is, well, the same thing that it's materialism. It's that everything is at root atoms, particles colliding with each other, and that whatever arrangement these atoms had in the very beginning determined mechanically the arrangement that they have now and have had and will have to infinity. Whether that's coherent or not is another question. How did this begin is obviously a relevant question. But that's the sense in which he is a determinist.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, is it on? So the question I had was about the rhetoric in a way. You were convinced in a sense by the emotional appeal. And I was just thinking about the work of Charles Taylor, who says that people hold to the secular age. They don't care about what the facts say or what necessarily who says them, but really the narrative that is being sold.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you say that you don't think that that is Nietzsche's main thrust, is the narrative he's selling. You think that he's selling himself more than the narrative.
Well, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about Charles Taylor and this idea of narrative. So what is it about the narrative that appeals to the people who buy into it?
Well,
which of the sort of appeals does the narrative make? So why are they invested in this idea of this particular narrative?
Well, let me just give you an example. So in the second document you have with Nietzsche, right? Courage, secret, a kind of Gnosticism, right? Mr. Rash and curious, impulsive, more curious than others, worthy of danger, liking the perilous, being unlike the careful. And what Charles Taylor would be that you're alone, that you have the courage to face the world, that you know that you don't seek out what other people seek out.
Okay, yeah. So that narrative, I think, appeals to us on an emotional level. The reason I think that narrative, I think it appeals to what's worst in us, but moreover, I don't think that in the long run it's as instrumental in our belief formation, for the same reason that Nietzsche leaves me cold now. And I think that's because eventually, whatever faith, if you're honest with yourself, you realize that you're not really all that daring or bold or autonomous or independent or clever or wise or to write very such good books. I think not even very much self-scrutiny leads to the contradiction of that narrative. And why it is that some people, despite the testimony of experience, cling to that narrative? Well, I think maybe, here's maybe a thought. Have you ever heard of the ethical appeal? It's not something that most of the students that I've had have heard of. It's not an appeal we see exerted very often. I think if, for instance, we as Christians exerted a better ethical appeal, I think that would be a huge difference in people's lives. The ethical appeal is not just what you say, but what you do. For instance, do you say one thing and do another? That is going to undermine your ethical appeal. I think there are all sorts of ways, and of course, again, Christians are no different in this crucial respect from anyone else. But I think that it's very difficult to exert an effective ethical appeal in writing, in one's life. And I think it's more difficult because it's not something people are used to thinking about. We think of, the argument is either logically sound or it's appealing to our emotions. In rhetorical analyses, popular rhetorical analyses, it's the either or. And I think it's the effectiveness of the ethical appeal has diminished as it has been neglected. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, was to talk about its importance. Does that answer your question at all?
And Nietzsche says, if I'd believe the redeemed if they acted like it or something, or they acted more redeemed.
He does say that. So one of his major criticisms of Christianity is that, well, Nietzsche is not as original as he wants you to think. He has a long passage in Genealogy of Morals where he cites Tertullian, the church father, who has this piece of writing, Ron, I'm sure you're familiar with it, where he says, and Aquinas later followed him in this, that part of the blessedness of those in heaven will consist in observing the punishments of the damned, right? And Nietzsche saw this, not without reason, I think, as in contradiction with love for enemies, for instance. So it's stuff like that that gives Nietzsche a lot of his firepower. And that is a very poor ethical appeal that Tertullian makes in favor of the gospel, I believe. So yes, you're absolutely right. A lot of, in fact, Nietzsche says elsewhere that Jesus was, he says it in some superlative way that Jesus was like the embodiment of the perfectly decent, ethical man or something like that, right? So Jesus is not the problem. It's Christians. That's one of the problems. And Kierkegaard's critique of institutional Christianity shares some of the things in common with that. But you're absolutely right. So I think with a little more attention paid to to that, a little more consciousness of the fact that we make ethical appeals doing everything that we do. This cultural buying in to the narrative and the seduction of the emotional appeal might not have quite the power that it does. Just a thought, though.
Thank you. You can make a kind of reverse ethical appeal, I think. Would you agree with that? Where you assassinate the character of the person whose views you wish to oppose.
Yes, and either that is valid or it's fallacious. For instance, if you were to have assassinated my character, like Eliot tried to assassinate mine, then that would be a misuse, that would be a fallacious ethical appeal. But yes, if, for instance, you have someone to be a pathological liar, and this person is sworn in, if you bring up the fact this person was a pathological liar, it bears directly, it's relevant to the matter under discussion. So that has to do with it. Is it relevant to the matter under discussion?
So what qualifies, or what even could qualify as an ethical appeal can be affected by culture. And what I'm thinking of in particular is, gender politics, right? And so we have what we call virtue signaling going on.
David Foster Wallace talks a lot about that in this essay.
Yeah. And basically, you communicate to your audience that you're really okay because you're on board with gender politics.
Yeah, so that's an ethical appeal that those people are making.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. Depending on all of this depends on the audience. What I may think is a persuasive logical appeal may not strike you as persuasive. Could be the same type of appeal. I may find your ethical appeal persuasive. Someone else, it might leave cold. In the same way, obviously we've talked about this emotional appeal falling upon deaf ears with some people, striking other people as very effective. So culture, the kinds of appeals, ethical appeals that are effective now might not be effective tomorrow, may not have been effective yesterday. And so all of this is much more complicated probably than, it's not cut and dry or simple or any of those things. But yeah, those are great observations about just how much is involved in any of these appeals, really.
I'm sorry.
No.
Some people, myself included, were attracted to the gospel by the character of Jesus. And there's a fellow, Simon Greenleaf, who was one of the founders of Harvard Law, and he wrote a 30-page tract about this. But the way he ended it is so memorable, and I just love it so much. And I can't quote it, but basically he said, the character of Jesus is so exalted that the disciples could not have invented him if he hadn't actually existed.
Yeah. Even if they had been as good psychologists as Nietzsche. But yeah, in some ways, I didn't get to work this in. I could have, in a separate talk, this would be part of it. Jesus represents the ultimate ethical appeal. And in fact, the ethical appeal he exerts is part and parcel of his theological significance, right? It's because Jesus lived the perfect life that he can bring about atonement for our very poor ethical appeals. So yeah, that's another great point, and kind of the direction I was originally hoping to go in. But thank you, Ron. And thank all of you.